Laverne Bell, a 76-year-old black woman, sat quietly on the front porch of her old home and was charged with trespassing. She didn't cry or plead. Instead, after the judge sentenced her, she made one silent phone call. Minutes later, the courtroom froze as her daughter walked in. A mother trying to hold on to memories, a system determined to erase them. But who really broke the law that day? What does real justice mean to you? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Now let's hear the full story of Mrs. Laverne Bell. They called her case first thing that morning like they always did with the ones no one would care about. Just another name to clear before lunch. When the bailiff opened the side door, a small, elderly black woman stepped slowly into the courtroom. She didn't look around. She didn't shuffle or hesitate. She just walked quiet and upright like she knew where to go and wasn't in any rush to get there. Her name was Laverne Bell, 76 years old, and from the way people stared, you'd think she'd wandered in by mistake. She wore a faded cardigan, gray slacks that had seen better years, and orthopedic shoes that barely made a sound. No makeup, no jewelry. Nothing about her demanded attention, and maybe that's why everyone kept staring. A few whispers floated through the back rows. That's her. She's the one who wouldn't leave that porch. Thought she was homeless. No one offered her a seat. No one offered her a smile. She didn't seem to mind. She simply stood there, hands clasped in front of her like she'd done this many times before. At the side of the room, Officer Jenkins sat flipping through a stack of intake files. It was just another court day for him until his fingers stopped on one page. His eyes paused at the name, then dropped to the address, 415 Maple Avenue. He blinked once. That street. That number. There was something about it, something tugging at the edge of a memory he couldn't quite place. He looked up slowly, looked at the woman now sitting alone at the defendant's table. Her back was straight, her expression unreadable. She wasn't fidgeting, she wasn't praying, she wasn't even confused. She just waited. In the press row, a young reporter named Elena Cruz raised her camera and took a quick photo. She was new to the courthouse beat, eager to prove she could spot a story when no one else did. But this wasn't the kind of headline that screamed for ink, not at first glance. A trespassing charge against a widow, the public wouldn't blink. Still, something in the way this woman sat. It didn't match the file Elena had read. The official record called her defiant, belligerent, non-compliant. But the woman before her didn't look defiant. She looked centered. Settled. Like she knew something no one else in the room did. Elena zoomed in closer. That face, it wasn't empty. It was full of silence. And silence, Elena had learned early on, had many different volumes. Judge Raymond Locke had yet to enter. The courtroom had that stale hush it always did before a session began. The lawyers were busy checking papers. A few clerks whispered by the jury box. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, making everything feel a little colder than it already was. It wasn't just the air that was cold, it was the people. The whole room seemed indifferent, detached, as if they'd already decided what kind of woman Laverne Bell was. No one leaned in to hear her story, no one wondered what led her here, except Officer Jenkins, who kept glancing back and forth between the case file and the woman in front of him. He finally stood up and approached the prosecutor's table, whispering something to the assistant DA, who gave a quick shrug like he couldn't be bothered. Behind them, Elena lowered her camera, opened her laptop, and started typing. Elderly black woman charged with trespassing on what used to be her own front porch. Laverne shifted ever so slightly in her chair, just enough to turn her face toward the front of the courtroom. Her eyes settled on the empty bench where the judge would soon sit. And for the briefest moment, no more than a few seconds, Elena caught a glimpse of her profile. It was then she noticed it. That look. It wasn't fear. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't even resignation. It was stillness. The kind of stillness that came from a place deeper than defeat. The kind that said, "You don't know me, and you don't scare me." The bailiff cleared his throat. "All rise," he called out, and everyone stood as Judge Locke entered. But as the sound of chairs scraping and shoes shuffling filled the room, Elena kept her eyes locked on Laverne Bell, because in that moment she knew what most people hadn't yet realized. This was not just a trespassing case, and that quiet woman in the worn cardigan, she wasn't here by accident. She was here with purpose, and something Elena didn't know what yet was about to unfold. The door behind the bench creaked open, and Judge Raymond Locke entered like a man walking into a room he already owned. His presence didn't just demand silence, it pressed down on it. His black robe dragged slightly behind him as he moved not from age but from weight. The weight of years spent passing judgment without question. The weight of believing he was always right. He didn't look at this prosecution. He didn't nod at the audience. He didn't glance at the young reporter with the camera. He went straight to her. His eyes locked on Laverne Bell and his lips curled ever so slightly like someone who'd just stepped in something unpleasant. "Well, you again." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It sliced through the courtroom like a blade across old wood. Laverne didn't move. She didn't flinch. She just met his stare, quiet as stone. Elena Cruz in the press row stopped typing. "You've been warned before," Judge Locke continued, his voice dropping to a sneer. "And yet here we are. Same woman, same address, same delusion." Delusion. That word hung in the air like the stench of something rotten. The Assistant District Attorney Monroe stood abruptly clutching his file as if that would bring order to the room. "Your Honor, the state charges Ms. Bell with criminal trespass under Code 1263B. She was found once again on the front steps of 4 and 15 Maple Avenue. That property is not hers," Locke interrupted, not even bothering to look at Monroe. His eyes never left Laverne. Not anymore. And she knows it. Monroe cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Yes, sir. The property was foreclosed and auctioned. County ownership is fully documented. Officers on the scene report that Ms. Bell refused to leave. She told them, quote, 'I'm not leaving what's mine.'" She resisted, Locke asked sharply. "Verbally only." She remained seated, refused to vacate. "So she's defiant, just passive about it." Laverne leaned forward slightly. Her voice, though quiet, cut through the tension like glass. "I wasn't defiant, I was grieving." That stopped Monroe. Even the judge blinked once. "I didn't break into that house," she said. "I sat on the porch my husband built with his own hands before he left for war. The same porch I waited on the day they told me he wasn't coming back." A low murmur stirred in the back of the courtroom. Locke banged the gavel once, not hard, just enough to remind everyone he was still the loudest man in the room. "This isn't about your memories, Ms. Bell," he snapped. "This is about trespassing. The law doesn't care where you sat or what ghost you were waiting for." "The law should," she said. Locke narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me, the law should care," Laverne repeated. "Because it doesn't mean much if it only protects the powerful and punishes the quiet." Elena's breath caught. She didn't know whether to take notes or just listen. She opened her phone instead and searched the name Laverne Bell. The first few results were dry court listings, tax issues, old property records. But then she saw it. An archived news piece from 12 years ago, retired military architect honored for Veterans Housing Initiative. The photo showed Laverne standing proud next to a blueprint. The headline didn't say trespasser. It said builder, visionary, served. Back in the courtroom, Locke's tone sharpened. "You think you're above the law, Ms. Bell?" "No," she said. "I think you've forgotten how to see people." The room stiffened. Locke leaned back, almost amused now. "You want pity, you won't find it here. I didn't come for pity." "Then why are you here?" he barked. "Because the porch still remembers," she said. "Even if you don't." There it was. That moment. That flash of truth that made people uncomfortable. Jenkins shifted in his seat. Monroe stopped fiddling with his papers, and Elena, still holding her phone, whispered one word to herself. "Damn." Because now it was clear this case wasn't about property lines or legal codes. It was about something deeper, something that didn't fit neatly into a courtroom record. Locke didn't want to hear it. He waved Monroe back to his seat, then looked down at Laverne again. "You're not a victim here," he growled. "You're a criminal." Laverne held his gaze. "And you're not a judge," she answered. "You're just a man hiding behind a bench." The gavel struck wood hard this time, and the sound echoed like a shot. "Enough," Locke said. "You'll have your say when I allow it." She didn't respond. She didn't need to, because the room had already shifted. People weren't looking at the judge anymore. They were looking at her. Judge Raymond Locke leaned forward ever so slightly, his eyes narrowing like a man circling in on a weakness he could finally name. "You've had warnings. You've had citations, and yet you keep returning to the same place. So tell this court, Ms. Bell, why that porch?" The courtroom held its breath. not because the question was unexpected, but because everyone sensed something different about the way she was going to answer. Laverne didn't look at the judge. She looked beyond him, past the bench, past the walls, to some quiet place the rest of the room couldn't follow. Her voice, when it came, was low, steady, unshaken. "My husband," she began, used to say, "a home is only as strong as the porch it rests on." No one moved. Not even Jenkins, who was still holding the report in his lap. "We built it together," she continued. "Brick by brick. Just the two of us." Malcolm wasn't one for big speeches, but he laid those bricks like it was sacred work. He said if we made the entry strong, the rest would follow. There was no poetry in her tone, just the kind of truth that can't be dressed up. "That porch," she said, "was where he proposed, where we brought our son home, where we celebrated the day the war ended." She paused, long enough that you could hear a soft murmur of the courthouse vents kicking on. "He was a Navy corpsman, served 3 tours in Afghanistan. The last one was supposed to be it. He had his out-processing papers, said he was done, he was coming home." The room grew stiller. Then one morning 2 men in uniform knocked on our door. I remember because it was raining. I remember because I knew before they even said a word. A silence fell across the gallery. Not heavy, not awkward, reverent. "They sent me back his boots," she whispered. "And his dog tags, that's all." Jenkins turned his eyes down, pretending to check something in the file. But there was nothing on the page he hadn't already read. "That porch is the last place I held him. The last place he stood before he shipped out. It's where I sat to read his letters and where I sat when they stopped coming." She turned then not to the judge but to the room, like someone who wasn't asking for sympathy but offering understanding. "It's where I sat every Sunday after church, through winters, through treatments, through losing my job. That porch held my life when I didn't know how to hold it myself." Locke cleared his throat. "This court recognizes your grief," he said, his voice tight. "But grief does not exempt you from the law." She finally turned to face him. "I didn't break in," she said. "Didn't touch a doorknob. Didn't cross a line. I just sat. In the same place I've sat for nearly 4 decades. "And yet," Locke replied, "the home no longer belongs to you." "No," she said, "but the memories do, and you can't foreclose on those." Monroe shifted uncomfortably at the prosecution table. Jenkins's fingers, once still, began to lightly tap against the folder in his lap as if trying to shake off a feeling he couldn't name. Laverne looked down briefly, then back up. "I'm not resisting your honor. I'm remembering. And if sitting with my memories is trespassing, then yes, I'm guilty." The words didn't echo, but they landed. In a way you could feel. Even the judge seemed to sit back a little. Elena Cruz, seated near the front with her camera on her lap, stared at the woman who just minutes ago had looked like someone the court could forget. Now no one could take their eyes off her. Locke drew in a breath sharper than before. "This court is not a place for sentimental recollections," he said. "It is a place of law. Then the law should remember who it serves." Laverne replied gently, "Because I used to believe it served people like me." A flicker of something crossed Jenkins's face. Not disagreement, recognition. He glanced once more at the charge sheet, at the line that read "Criminal Trespass, 415 Maple Avenue." And for the first time, it didn't feel like a violation of property. It felt like the violation had come from the system itself. He looked back at the bench. The judge was silent now. The room didn't quite know what to do with her words. And somehow, without raising her voice or standing from her chair, Laverne Bell had become the one holding the courtroom in place. Judge Locke sat still for a long moment, as if waiting for the weight of Laverne's words to dissolve on their own. But they didn't. They lingered in the air like smoke curling into corners no one wanted to look at. When he finally spoke, his voice was clipped, measured, almost mechanical. "This court has heard your statement and acknowledges your perspective. However, the facts remain unchanged." He glanced briefly at the assistant district attorney as if offering him a chance to intervene. Monroe didn't move. His eyes lowered. There was hesitation, but not enough. "The defendant, Ms. Laverne Bell, is hereby sentenced to 30 days in county detention for criminal trespassing." For half a breath, the courtroom didn't react. No gasp, no protest. Just silence, dense and unnatural. Then came a sound so soft it was barely heard, of a pen slipping from a reporter's hand. Elena Cruz blinked, then lowered her camera slowly. Her notepad was already half filled, but she added one more line beneath the rest, sentenced for sitting with the memory of her husband. It wasn't just tragic, it was absurd. From the bench, Locke adjusted his robe like a man brushing off something he couldn't quite name. He didn't look at Laverne again, as if doing so might make it harder to believe in what he'd just done. Laverne didn't flinch, no sigh, no plea. She simply nodded once, as if confirming something only she had already known. Then she raised her hand, not trembling, not desperate, just calm. "May I make one phone call before I'm taken?" Locke arched a brow. "This isn't a holding cell, Ms. Bell, it's a courtroom. I registered a medical exemption ahead of the hearing. My doctor submitted documentation last week. She said it without emotion. Just fact." Locke sighed, clearly annoyed at being reminded of procedure, but he waved a hand in permission. "Fine. Officer Jenkins will assist you. One call. Keep it brief." Jenkins stepped forward more slowly than usual. There was a strange pull in his gut, a voice he'd learned to ignore years ago during training now whispering louder than ever. He retrieved the department-issued phone from his belt and walked it to her, placing it gently into her hands like he was handing off something sacred. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. She didn't thank him. She didn't have to. Something in the stillness between them said more. She dialed a number with practiced ease. It rang once, then twice, then clicked. "Laverne Bell," she said. "Code 6. It's time." That was all. She handed the phone back without looking up. Jenkins felt the weight of the device in his hand heavier than before. He didn't know what Code 6 meant, but the chill that slid down his back told him it wasn't just a doctor's appointment. Ada Monroe shifted again in his seat, glancing toward Laverne with a new kind of curiosity. He opened the folder in front of him, flipping back through arrest notes as if trying to locate something he might have missed. A detail, a name, a line of background they hadn't looked closely enough at. Because something had just shifted. And it wasn't just the room, it was the balance of control. Laverne folded her hands in her lap and sat back peaceful as ever. Not smug, not satisfied. Just ready. Judge Locke, not yet aware of the ripple he'd triggered, banged the gavel once unnecessarily loud. "Court is adjourned." But no one moved, not right away. Elena's fingers hovered over her keyboard, but she didn't type. Jenkins stayed standing beside Laverne, the phone still in his hand, its screen dim now but somehow pulsing with implication. It was Monroe who finally broke the stillness, rising from his seat, with less certainty than when he'd arrived. He gave Laverne a glance that hovered between apology and fear. Outside the courtroom doors, a hallway buzzed faintly with security chatter, radio clicks, footsteps moving faster than usual. Laverne sat motionless. The faintest smile touched her lips. Not from triumph, but memory. Like someone who'd just lit a fuse and quietly watched the countdown begin. Officer Jenkins stepped back and swallowed his instincts, prickling. He didn't know who she had called, but suddenly he wasn't sure if anyone in that room had truly known who she was at all. And whatever was coming next, it would not be quiet. Laverne didn't hesitate. Her fingers moved with quiet certainty as she pressed a single button on the phone Jenkins had handed her. She didn't look at the screen, didn't wait for a prompt. "It's me," she said. "Time's up." The courtroom was still for a beat. Most thought they'd misheard. Others weren't sure what the words even meant. She handed the phone back and folded her hands neatly in her lap. Her face unreadable, calm in a way that felt unnatural for a woman who'd just been sentenced to 30 days in jail. Someone in the gallery shifted. A teenager who'd been live streaming the proceedings slowly lowered their phone without being told. Something in the air had changed, not loud, not sudden, but unmistakable. Tension. Unearned, unexplained, but real. From the press row, Elena Cruz leaned toward Jenkins. Who did she just call? He didn't speak. His eyes stayed locked on Laverne. A slow shake of his head was all the answer she got. Judge Locke tapped his gavel again, sharper this time. "We're finished here. Remove the defendant. Officer Jenkins, if you would." But he never got to finish that sentence. Because right then the courtroom doors swung open with a force that silenced the entire room. 3 individuals stepped through. Dark suits, no visible badges, but their presence was louder than any uniform. They didn't look around, didn't ask permission. They walked with a precision that screamed authority, the kind that doesn't wait for court recess. The lead figure, a black woman with silver streaks at her temples, cut through the center aisle like the room was hers. She didn't glance at the judge. She didn't nod to security. She didn't need to. She stopped just 3 feet from Laverne Bell and said low and deliberate, "Ma'am, we're in position." The entire courtroom held its breath. Laverne stood, smooth, effortless, like she'd just been waiting for the cue. She didn't look surprised. She didn't ask questions. She looked the woman in the eyes and replied, "Thank you, Director. Not Miss. Not ma'am. Director." You could feel the oxygen get sucked from the room. Judge Locke stood abruptly. "Excuse me. This is a court of law. I demand to know." But the woman finally turned her gaze to him and shut him down with nothing more than a stare. "No, Your Honor," she said. "This was a court of law. What happens next is above your jurisdiction." He froze. Ada Monroe stood halfway, half-folding the file in his hands. "Wait, Director of what?" The woman didn't answer, but Jenkins, still holding the courtroom phone, caught it. The faint seal embossed on the folder under her arm. Not gold, not military. Black ink. 5 letters. A ghost division no one speaks of out loud. CRISA. Even he had only heard the name whispered once in training. Laverne nodded once to Jenkins as she passed him. Her hand briefly touched his arm. Not command, not thanks, just a quiet confirmation that he was right, to feel the weight of something bigger moving in the room. Elena nearly dropped her pen. Laverne walked toward the door with the agents flanking her. No handcuffs, no resistance. And when the door clicked shut behind them, it was as if the entire trial vanished into vapor. Silence fell again, but this time it was different. Not confused, not uncomfortable, but hollow. Like everyone had been playing checkers and suddenly realized someone else had been playing chess the whole time. Judge Locke sank slowly back into his chair. He looked to Monroe, to the deputies, then to the bailiff, but there were no answers. The entire courtroom had become a question without a sentence. Jenkins finally whispered, "Who is she?" No one could answer. But everyone now understood something. Laverne Bell hadn't come to court to defend herself. She'd come to trigger something, and the system had just walked into her plan. The courtroom had barely begun to settle from what had just happened. Jenkins was still standing in place, his hand empty where the phone had been. Elena sat motionless, pen frozen above her notebook. Ada Monroe was flipping through files, clearly looking for something, anything that might make sense of the last 20 minutes. Judge Locke, pale and rattled, sipped from a glass of water that hadn't left a ring on the desk in over an hour. Then the doors opened again. It wasn't loud, but the sound was different, purposeful, controlled. 3 people entered. 2 of them wore navy suits, tailored, pressed, silent. They flanked the woman in the middle like bookends to a title the room didn't yet understand. And the woman, she wore no robe, no uniform, no visible badge. But her presence, even before her name was spoken, seemed to correct the posture of everyone in the room. Bull. Elena's eyes widened. "No way." Judge Locke straightened slightly. "Please identify yourself." The woman stopped in front of the bench, but she didn't bow. She didn't yield. "My name," she said, calm and cutting, "is Congresswoman Danielle Bell, former military attorney, current ranking legal advisor to the Joint Judiciary Committee." She turned, eyes flicking toward the defense table where her mother had stood just minutes earlier. "I'm here on behalf of Laverne Bell, who, unless I'm mistaken, was just sentenced to jail for the crime of remembering her husband." Ada Monroe rose. "Your Honor, I wasn't informed of any special representation." "You weren't informed because justice doesn't come with a calendar alert," Danielle snapped. "It arrives when it's been delayed long enough." Judge Locke cleared his throat. "You have no standing in this proceeding." "I have standing," she replied, "in 3 federal districts, including this one. And more importantly, I have this." She handed a thick file to the court clerk. "Original deed to 415 Maple Avenue. Certified. Stamped. Verified. Still in my mother's name." Locke opened the folder and scanned the top page. His eyes darted to Monroe. Danielle continued, now addressing the entire courtroom. "For months, my mother's property has been falsely listed as foreclosed due to clerical negligence and deliberate inaction. No court order for eviction was filed. No proper notice was served. And yet, here she is, sentenced by a bench that didn't even ask why she returned to that porch." Ada Monroe interrupted again. "This court relied on the county's property records, which clearly show—" "You relied on what was convenient," Danielle cut in, stepping closer. "Not what was true." There was a beat of silence. Then someone in the gallery gasped. "Wait, Bell. She's her daughter. That's Congresswoman Bell." The murmur spread like wildfire. Phones came out. Whispers turned into shuffling feet. Even the bailiff looked unsure. Judge Locke banged his gavel once. "This is a courtroom. I will not have this." But Danielle's voice rose, not loud, but undeniable. "You sentenced a 76-year-old widow to jail for sitting on her own porch. You didn't ask for her story. You didn't even look her in the eyes when you gave that ruling." She turned now, locking eyes with him. "My mother served as a military architect for 22 years. That home was built with her hands and her husband's. She didn't trespass. She remembered. And you punished her for that." Locke leaned forward, tense. "Congresswoman Bell, this is not the place." "Oh, but it is," she said softer now. "Because this is where it happened. And if this courtroom has forgotten what justice looks like, then let me reintroduce it." She nodded to one of the lawyers behind her. The man stepped forward and placed another folder on the bench. "Supplemental exhibits," Danielle explained. "Record of selective enforcement from this court cases where elderly black defendants received disproportionately harsh sentences for minor infractions. Your signature's on more than half." Locke's hand froze mid-reach. Elena whispered to Jenkins, "Are we watching a takedown?" He didn't answer. He was staring at the judge. Danielle stepped closer again. "You sat there and looked at my mother like she was nobody. But she raised 2 daughters, buried a war hero, and taught engineering at a time when black women weren't even allowed in the room." She took a breath. "You didn't break her. You didn't even shake her. You just revealed the cracks in your own foundation." Someone from the back shouted, "Say it louder," Judge Locke snapped. "Remove that man." "No," Danielle said firmly. "You don't get to control the room anymore." And for a moment he didn't. The entire chamber had turned. Eyes weren't on the judge. They were on the daughter, who stood in place of the mother who'd sat in silence and made a single phone call that morning. The same mother who had known exactly what she was doing. Danielle looked down at the empty chair where her mother had sat. Then, almost as if speaking to her directly, "You gave them silence, Mama. Now let them hear your echo." She turned back to the court. "I am filing an immediate injunction to overturn this sentence and submitting a formal ethics complaint to the Judicial Oversight Board. I also have a subpoena prepared for the Assistant District Attorney regarding case selection bias." She let the words settle like dust. Locke sat in rigid silence. He glanced around as if seeking support. But no one came to his aid. Even Monroe lowered his gaze. Danielle's voice was the last to rise. "You thought no one would notice a quiet black woman on a porch. But now everyone's watching, and we're not leaving." She stepped back. Her attorneys followed. And this time, when the courtroom doors closed behind her, they didn't slam. They echoed, like something had finally cracked, like history had just shifted, even if no one in that room could yet explain how. For a moment, it felt like no one in the room breathed. Judge Locke's gavel sat untouched. His lips parted as if to speak, but the words never came. Danielle Bell hadn't shouted yet. She had cracked open the walls with less than a paragraph. And what came next made sure those cracks never closed. Danielle returned to the center of the courtroom, this time with another file in hand. She didn't speak right away. She placed it on the bench with a calmness that made Monroe visibly tense. "This," she said, "is the case transcript from a 2009 conviction you presided over, Your Honor. Calvin Price, decorated black Marine, falsely accused of striking a police officer during a peaceful protest outside Fort Jackson." Locke blinked slow. "That case was settled long ago, overturned quietly," Danielle replied. Her voice steady as stone because the security footage proved Price never laid a hand on anyone. "You didn't allow it into evidence. You denied the defense's request for a delay, refused to recuse, and sentenced him to a year in jail." Locke raised a hand, but Danielle didn't stop. "You sealed that correction to protect your record. But records speak even when you try to silence them." The room shifted. Elena's phone was already recording. Behind her, more spectators pulled out theirs. Ada Monroe. Danielle turned toward him. "Are you aware that over the past 10 years, this courtroom has imposed maximum sentencing on black veterans in over 70% of minor offense cases brought before it?" Monroe hesitated. I'd have to review those numbers." "I already did," Danielle said and handed him a summary sheet, cross-referenced with county data. "You'll find your signature on most of the charges." Monroe looked down at the page as if it might combust. "Enough," Locke snapped. "You're grandstanding, Congresswoman." "No," Danielle said quietly. "I'm witnessing something you should have done for my mother." She opened another file. "Motion to vacate the sentence of Laverne Bell." filed with supporting evidence of judicial bias and constitutional violation, signed and time-stamped. Judge Locke stared at the document but didn't touch it. Monroe shifted his weight. Your Honor. Monroe said slowly, the state will not oppose this motion. The gallery rippled. One sound, one moment, small but seismic. A public concession. Locke's hand hovered above the gavel. His shoulders sank. Motion granted, he said, voice hoarse. Charges are vacated. Case dismissed. No cheers followed. No one clapped. But in that silence, dignity returned to one woman's name. Laverne stood slowly. She didn't turn toward the crowd, nor toward the press. She looked only at the judge, the man who had sentenced her to jail for remembering. I didn't come here to be freed, she said softly. I came to be seen. Locke met her eyes but said nothing. His power, once unshakable, now felt borrowed. I sat on that porch because it was the last piece of my husband I had left. We built that home together. It wasn't a crime. It was memory. Then she turned to Danielle and something passed between them that needed no words. Elena whispered to Jenkins, Are you seeing this? He nodded quietly. I'm more than seeing it. Danielle stepped forward again. I have also filed a formal complaint to the Judicial Oversight Board, along with data pointing to systemic bias in prior rulings from this bench. And I will be calling for an independent review of property seizure protocols in Chatham County. Judge Locke's knuckles whitened on the bench. You're trying to destroy me. No, Danielle answered. You did that yourself. I'm just making sure people finally notice. Then, for the first time, someone in the gallery said aloud what others had only whispered. She brought down a judge. Another added, no, she restored justice. Laverne gave a faint smile. This wasn't justice. It was repair. Elena posted the live stream with a simple caption. She didn't shout. She stood. Within 15 minutes, the clip had 200K views. Before sunset, it hit the national news cycle. Back in the courtroom, Jenkins placed a hand on the empty defense chair. It still carried the warmth of the woman who had sat there. The same woman no one had defended until her daughter tore open the walls. He exhaled, slow, proud. He had handed her the phone earlier out of protocol. Now it felt like the most human thing he'd done all year. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited, but Danielle and Laverne didn't stop. No interviews, no podiums. Just two women walking side by side down the stone steps. The crowd parted, and in that quiet, someone whispered, That's what power looks like. Not the loud kind, the kind that endures. They thought it would end at the courthouse steps. They thought once the charges were dropped, the world would move on. But it didn't. That evening, the hashtag Laverne Bell began showing up on timelines like quiet echoes. No ads, no influencers, just a ripple. A sentence here, a photo there, a story carried by strangers who had never met her but recognized something in her stillness. One post came from a high school teacher in Des Moines, a picture of her classroom whiteboard, and beneath it the caption, Today I told my students about a woman who built homes for forgotten soldiers and was nearly jailed for sitting on her porch. She drew the plans we study in architecture class. Her name is Laverne Bell. Another came from a nurse in Georgia. She treated my dad back in '03 when she volunteered at the VA. He cried when he saw her on the news. There were thousands like it. Some short, some angry, some reverent, but all pointed in the same direction, people finally seeing someone they'd overlooked. Jenkins sat at his desk late that night, lights off, uniform, shirt unbuttoned. He'd watched the live stream again 3 times, not because he enjoyed it, but because something in him refused to let the silence settle. He pulled out a piece of lined paper, the kind usually reserved for department incident reports, and wrote, I saw you. I didn't understand, but I saw you, and I'm sorry. He folded it carefully. Didn't sign it. Just wrote the address from the police report, 415 Maple Avenue. He didn't know if the letter would ever reach her. He only knew it had to be sent. Somewhere else on a college campus across the state, a group of political science majors gathered around a laptop. They weren't waiting for permission. They were launching a petition. Every case presided over by Judge Locke should be reviewed independently. The page read, Bias doesn't disappear because it's been caught. It spreads until someone stops it. By morning, they had 27,000 signatures. Danielle didn't speak to the press. She didn't need to. Her silence had already spoken louder than most campaigns ever could. But late that night, she opened her email and saw a message from a young woman named Tasha. It said my mom was locked up for 6 months because she couldn't prove she lived where she did. I used to be ashamed. But your mother made me proud again. Thank you for standing. Danielle read it twice before forwarding it to her mother. Laverne read it, then closed the laptop, hands resting gently on the table. She didn't ask for any of this. Not the headlines. Not the apologies. Not the sudden fame. All she'd wanted was a moment of stillness on a porch that used to carry the sound of her husband's boots. All she'd wanted was to be close to what remained. Now the world knew her name, and somehow it didn't feel like a spotlight. It felt like respect. When the press conference began, no one expected her to speak. After all, most people had only just learned her name. But there she was, Laverne Bell, standing in front of a wall of microphones in the same modest jacket she'd worn to court. Not out of defiance, just because it was hers. The crowd quieted like something sacred had entered the space. A dozen reporters shouted over one another, tossing questions like stones, but Laverne didn't flinch. She scanned the faces, then pointed gently at a young woman standing off to the side. It was Elena. She wasn't holding up a phone like the others. She had a pen, a notepad, and her voice didn't chase anything. Mrs. Bell, she began, what would you say to those who believe you were trying to reclaim property? Laverne took a breath, not to compose herself, but to let the weight of the moment settle. I didn't reclaim land, she said. I reclaimed memory. And memory doesn't need permission. A quiet ripple passed through the crowd. She continued, her voice steady and warm. That porch knew my husband better than anyone still alive. It knew the rhythm of his boots when he came home tired. It held the weight of his body when he carried bad news. That porch was where he asked me to marry him. It's where we danced after we got the letter saying he was coming home for good. And it's where I sat when they told me he wouldn't. Someone lowered their camera. Another pressed record with trembling fingers. I didn't go back to cause trouble, she said. I went back to sit with my life. Because no matter what a judge says, a woman doesn't stop being a wife just because her husband is gone. Elena swallowed hard. Do you hold any anger, Mrs. Bell? Toward the court? The judge. Laverne looked at her, and for a moment her eyes shimmered not with tears, but with something older and heavier. No, she said softly. Anger takes up too much room. I just wish they'd listened sooner. I wish they'd seen past my skin, my wrinkles, and my clothes, and just looked at me like a human being. And that was all. No applause, no dramatics, just truth hanging in the air like a hymn. Elena posted the full video later that night. No editing, no music, just Laverne as she was. Across the country, people watched. Teachers, veterans, architects, mothers. Thousands of strangers sitting in silence with a woman they'd never met, suddenly feeling like they had. A teacher from Michigan tweeted I used one of her hospital wing designs in class last year. I didn't even know her name. Until now. In a small town in Nebraska, a girl sat beside her mother watching the video. When it ended, she looked up and asked, what did she do wrong? Her mother paused, then replied gently, she lived right. In Savannah, Officer Jenkins stood alone on his porch holding an envelope. Inside it was a handwritten letter. No name signed, just words. I'm sorry I didn't see you clearer, Mrs. Bell. I hope this finds its way to you. He sealed it and addressed it to 415 Maple Avenue. Whether it reached her or not didn't matter. Writing it did. That same evening, someone placed a bouquet of white lilies on the porch steps of the boarded-up house. The paper wrapping was plain. No note inside. Just a ribbon tied around the stems with one word written in black ink, honor. A young woman stood quietly after laying them down. She didn't take a photo. She didn't speak. She just stood there long enough to be part of something, then walked away. Laverne never returned to live there. She didn't need to, because now the world had finally seen what that porch held. And the porch, well, the porch remembered. Judge Raymond Locke sat alone long after the courthouse had emptied. The walls, once a fortress of authority, now felt cold and exposed. His robes hung over the back of the chair like a shadow he'd grown tired of wearing. Before him lay the case file. Laverne Bell's file creased at the corners from too many hands, too many assumptions. For a while he didn't move. He just stared at it as though it might rewrite itself if he looked long enough. Then slowly, almost mechanically, he reached for a pen. He didn't draft a statement. He didn't look for legal precedents. He simply turned to the final page, drew a single breath, and wrote 2 words. Case vacated. No flourish. No explanation. Just acknowledgement. Silent but irreversible. He closed the file, then stood up, but he wasn't alone. Laverne had stayed behind, just out of sight until that moment. She stepped forward quietly, her posture upright, her gaze steady. There was no bitterness in her eyes, only clarity. Locke opened his mouth, perhaps to offer an apology, but she raised a hand, gently stopping him without force. "Don't apologize," she said, her voice even. "Just start listening." For a long moment, nothing more was said. He nodded, not because he was ready, but because he finally understood he had been late. Laverne turned to leave, and Danielle was waiting at the door. They didn't rush. They didn't hold hands. But there was something sacred in the way they walked side by side, like memory and legacy had found common ground. As they stepped outside, the morning light poured across the courthouse steps, hitting Laverne's silver hair like a quiet crown. A small crowd had gathered, not shouting, not holding signs, just watching, witnessing. Among them was Elena, who'd been there since morning. She wasn't taking photos now. She just held her notebook close to her chest like it carried more than ink. That night, she wrote the final line of her article in the quiet of her apartment. She didn't yell. She didn't demand. She just stood still, and the system had to move. The piece went viral within hours, not because it was sensational, but because it was honest. No twists, no embellishments. Just a clear, unwavering truth about a woman who had once sat quietly on a porch and ended up shaking the pillars of a courthouse. A week later, the Judicial Review Board opened an ethics investigation into every case Judge Locke had presided over in the last 15 years. And in a small law school in Atlanta, a professor added a new case study to her syllabus. It wasn't about legal loopholes or precedent. It was titled Bell v. Silence. Jenkins, now reassigned to a training unit, began each new officer orientation with the same phrase. Before you reach for the cuffs, ask yourself, who are you really protecting? As for Laverne, she didn't do interviews anymore. She declined awards. She didn't want to be a symbol. She just wanted to visit her husband's grave each Sunday, then sit on any porch she pleased without someone calling it trespassing. Danielle often joined her, never in suits, never in heels. Just jeans and old sneakers. On some days, they barely spoke. They didn't need to. Because some stories aren't told with volume. They're told with presence, with patience, with the kind of strength that doesn't crash through doors but waits quietly until someone has no choice but to look up. And when they do, they see not a headline, not a protest, but a woman. Still standing, still remembering, still waiting for the world to start listening. Sometimes justice doesn't come from shouting. Sometimes it comes from standing still and being heard anyway. Laverne Bell didn't fight with fury. She stood in truth, and the world had no choice but to listen. Her story reminds us that memory matters, dignity matters, and no one is ever too small to be seen. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who still believes in quiet courage, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more powerful stories just like this one. Your support means everything. It helps our small team keep bringing real stories with real heart to the people who need them most. And remember, some stories may fade from headlines, but they live on in those who remember. At Mr. Mac's Stories, we don't just tell stories. We preserve memory. See you in the next one.